Jake Klingensmith, an instructor and teacher at the Plowshare. In this video, I'm going to be teaching you about the bees and their different activities within the hive. In order to keep your hive alive and healthy, it is essential to know how these different activities work within the hive. We will start here with the queen. The queen is the most essential bee within the colony. She's the mother of all the other bees. She lays between 1,000 to 1,500 eggs a day. So when you're raising a hive, you need a healthy queen. You need one that's vigorous. You need one that's going to produce the proper amount of eggs, essential to keep the hive running. So one of the main things in checking your hive is to check to see if you have a healthy queen. You want to make sure she's doing her job. The queen bee doesn't rule the hive in the sense that she tells every bee what to do. Rather, she emits a smell called pheromones. These pheromones cause the other bees to understand that she's there, and it also invigorates them to work harder. Anytime the pheromone cease to be within the hive, the bees will become lazy and not work as hard. The pheromones stimulate the bees to continue to work, build comb, bring in honey, pollen, nectar. The pheromones is what keeps the hive's cohesion. The queen lives about 2 to 3 years. The only time the bees ever raise a new queen is if the queen should die or the colony within the hive gets too large. Half the bees will leave. This is called swarming. The queen's life starts out as an egg laid in a special cell called a queen cell. The queen cell is much larger than any of the other cells in the hive, and they only build this cell at the time that they're going to raise a new queen. But they don't just build one, they build 15 to 30 of these cells. That's in case one of these cells doesn't hatch or the queen should die before she hatches out. The egg hatches 3 days later, and the worker bees begin to feed this larvae a high mineral substance called royal jelly. This royal jelly is secreted from glands on the worker's head. The worker bees feed this larvae so much royal jelly it literally floats like in a tub of royal jelly. The larvae begins to mature very quickly, and then after 8 days it spins its cocoon. At this stage it's called a pupa. After a total of 12 days, the queen hatches out as an adult queen. The worker bees at this point begin to groom her and take care of her. The queen's first job within the hive is to eliminate any other queens that may have hatched or are hatching. Remember, there's only supposed to be one queen within the hive, so she's got to dominate the hive. She goes into any of the other cells, she'll eat a hole in the side of the cell, and she stings the emerging queen that's still inside. If a queen has already emerged, there will be a fight and the strongest queen will win. After 3 days, the queen leaves the hive and she goes on a mating flight. She will fly within 2 to 3 miles from the hive and mate with anywhere from 10 to 17 drones. The queen will only go on this mating flight one time in her life. If the queen does not properly mate with enough drones, she will not be able to lay productively the entire 3 years of her life. After returning to the hive from her mating flight, 3 to 5 days later, she will begin her duty of laying eggs. Her production at first is very low, but within 2 weeks, she will be at her full capacity of 1,500 eggs a day. In general, there's only one queen in the hive. Every once in a while, there's an exception to this. If the queen's pheromones should weaken or diminish totally, the bees will begin to raise a new queen. And because the new queen that hatches cannot smell the old queen, every once in a while, you'll get a queen that'll work side by side. I found it interesting once when I opened up my hive and found 2 queens. It was the mother queen whose pheromones had totally stopped and the new queen working side by side. This is okay because eventually the older queen is going to die. As long as they're getting along, it's okay to have both of them in the hive. But this rarely happens. You'll rarely see this. The drone honeybee. The drone is the male honeybee in the hive. Although shorter than the queen, the drone is bulkier and noticeably larger than the worker bee. The drone's sole purpose in the hive is to mate with the queen. Although his lifespan is variable, it's rarely longer than 3 months. Because he has no stinger, wax glands, or pollen basket, he cannot carry on the normal activities of the rest of the worker bees. In the fall, when the weather begins to cool and the drone is no longer needed, the worker bees will chew the wings off the drone and chase it out of the front of the hive. Because he cannot fly back into the hive, he will die of starvation. In the spring and summer, There may be as many as 600 to 1,000 drones in a healthy hive. Next, we'll talk about the worker bee. The majority of the hive's population consists of the female worker bees. There is anywhere from 40 to 60,000 worker bees in a hive in the spring and summer. She's raised in a little bit of a different cell than the queen. The comb is constructed of many different cells, and in these cells is where the worker bee is raised. The worker bee starts as an egg. 3 days later, the larvae hatches from the egg. For the first 3 days of its larval life, it is fed royal jelly, just as the queen was. Then after that, the workers begin to dilute the royal jelly with some nectar and pollen. Because it is not fed royal jelly through its entire larval life, the worker bee's reproductive organs do not fully mature. After 8 days, the larvae spins its cocoon, and this is called the pupa stage. After a total of 21 days, the worker bee hatches out. After the bee hatches, its first task is to clean its cell. Then after that, it will begin to go and get some honey and pollen from the cells and feed it to the older larvae. At this point, its royal jelly glands begin to form, and it will feed the younger larvae at this time. The bee's next job in the hive is to build comb. The bees will hang from the top of the hive from each other, forming what we call a wax chain. The bees secrete the wax from glands on their abdomen. They pass the little scales up the chain, each bee adding their scale to each other's, until the last bee forms the scales into a hexagonal shape of the cells. All this construction is how the bees make their combs. Its next job in the hive is to greet all the incoming bees at the entrance. It gathers the nectar and pollen that they're bringing in from the field and stores it in the newly built combs. After that, the bee's next job before leaving the hive as a field bee is to stand at the entrance of the hive and guard it. Every bee coming into the hive has got to check in with the guard bees. If they bear their mother pheromones, they're welcome in. But if for some reason they should not or be from another hive, they will be chased out. There's one exception to this rule. If the bees are bringing in nectar or pollen, gifts, then they're just welcome in the hive whether they bear the queen pheromone or not. While working as a guard, the bee will take short flights, learning to navigate back to the hive. Once the bees have successfully learned how to navigate, they will then begin to gather nectar and pollen for the hive. The first bees that leave in the early morning are called scout bees. These bees go out and search for nectar and pollen. When they found a floral source, they go back to the hive and do something called a bee dance. This bee dance will tell the other bees exactly where to go to find this nectar or pollen. The bees dance in a figure 8. Depending on the angle of the figure 8 is going to tell the bees where the nectar source is in correlation with the sun. This is very important for the other bees to watch. The bee will do a vibration through the center of the figure 8. This vibration is going to tell them how far the nectar source is. If they vibrate very fast, it's very close. If they do a very long vibration, it's going to be a good distance away. The bees need to know this because they're going to store up on just the right amount of nectar to make it to the floral source. They don't want to store up on too much because they want to be able to bring back as much nectar as they possibly can. They don't want to store up on too little or they'll run out before they make it there. The bees know the floral source is getting close because they begin to run out of the nectar and honey that they stored up. Upon arriving on the flower, the bee will take in the nectar through its tongue and into its honey stomach. Here the bee adds enzymes from its stomach into the nectar. This is what will preserve the honey later on. The bee then flies back to the hive where it places the honey inside the cells. The rest of the bees guarding the entrance will fan their wings, circulating air through the hive. This is what dehydrates the nectar and turns it into honey. So the worker bee's life is about 45 days. There are over 25 different breeds of honeybees in the U.S. The more common ones that I've worked with are the Italian, Caucasian, Carnolian, Russian, and Buckfast. Each have their pros and cons. Some do better in colder climates and others do better in warmer climates. The Italian bees were originally brought over into the U.S. around the 1950s. They were brought over because the queens were a consistent golden color all the time. The Caucasians were brought over because they were able to adapt to the cooler weathers. The Carnolians, they had a longer tongue, and beekeepers thought they would be able to reach further into the flowers and get more nectar. The Russians were brought over more recently because of their resistance to the varroa mite. The varroa mite is a pest that will weaken the health of the colony. The Buckfast bee was brought over because they were a very docile bee. They're very gentle, and a lot of beekeepers like to keep them. I've worked with all of these, and I personally like the Italian and the Buckfast because they're a more gentle and docile bee. As a beekeeper, a lot of time is spent observing the life cycle within the hive and providing whatever is needed. Having an understanding of these activities will help you maintain a healthy hive.